Great. Okay, now I have 2 recordings. Okay. Amateur night tonight. What can I say? Okay. So let's talk about who he was, where he came from, what he did. Let me give you because it's a long story. I'm going to give you the beginning, middle, and end right off the bat, like the Reader's Digest version. Is a person who had illusions of grandeur. He, for various reasons, as we will see, believed he was the Mashiach. He tried to reveal himself in various cities. He got run out of different towns, eventually finds people who truly believe in him. One man in specific, known as Nathan of Gaza. And he reestablishes, the Shabbtai reestablishes Gaza, of all days to be talking about it, as a replacement for Jerusalem. And he's going to be the Melech HaMashiach. He had a tremendous following. Eventually, he's arrested by the Ottoman Turks. He's imprisoned, and he's faced with execution. He says, they tell him you got to convert to Islam or you get executed. He converts to Islam. And that kind of leaves a lot of people like, oops, we bet on the wrong horse. That's the Reader's Digest version. But there's so much more to know about him. We have to understand, how is it even possible that someone just out of the blue can declare himself as Mashiach and people follow him? Now, I do want to address one thing before we get started on this. And that has to do with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Zecher Tzadik V'Kadosh Livracha, who is not alive. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that unfortunately, there have been people who try to convolute an entire series of events and say, just like the people believed in Shabbtai Tzvi as being a false Mashiach, so too they believe in the Lubavitcher Rebbe as being a false Mashiach. So obviously he's dead, he's not a Mashiach, You cannot, that's comparing apples and bowling balls. Forget about apples and oranges. And it's important to understand that it's a different world. And we'll see as we learn about Shabbtai Tzvi, we'll come back near the end. We'll talk about the Lubavitcher Rebbe a little bit, the one who passed away in 80, whatever it was, 1990, I don't remember. Was it 86? No, Moshe was in 86. Anyways, so that, and then we'll start to really understand how you cannot compare the two. They claim, the Chabad claims that he is Mashiach, that he could be Mashiach. They say he himself said he was Mashiach and all. We'll deal with that eventually, maybe. But right now, because whenever I've taught about Shabbtai Tzvi, I always get the question, well, what about the Lubavitcher Rebbe? And you'll see and understand as we go through this that you absolutely cannot compare the two. So he was an Ottoman Jewish mystic. He was ordained as a rabbi in the town of Smyrna, which is Izmir today, as well as Izmir in Turkey. It's not really clear if he was considered Ashkenazi or Sephardi. Doesn't make a difference for our discussion, though. And he claimed to be, again, I'm kind of like starting off with the introductory sentence here. He claimed to be Mashiach, and he founded what would be known as in English the Sabbatean movement, or those who are Shabbtaut in Hebrew, the followers of Shabbtai Tzvi. Central to his teachings was the belief that during the Messianic period, which he himself saying as he was in the process of ushering in, those things that would have been considered sinful and horrible and you can't do them would suddenly transform into righteous acts. The doctrine, this belief, led Shabbtai Tzvi and his followers to deliberately violate Torah law. So even before I go any further than this, you could already see a massive difference between, I wasn't going to talk about it, I'm not going to, but Lubavitcher Rebbe and him. Okay? Because the Chasar Chalila, they say Lubavitcher Rebbe came to change Torah, to make things that were prohibited, to make them permissible. So it's really important you put that out of your mind. But this whole idea of taking what was prohibited and making it permissible, that whole, I'll say, controversial practice eventually inspires a later movement by this Rav Yaakov Frankel, Yaakov Frankel. We'll learn about him also. So where's he come from? Again, he was born in the city of Smyrna. Supposedly, he was born on Tisha B'Av. Now, why I say supposedly is we don't know exactly his birthday, And the reason that people say supposedly on Tisha B'Av is that one of the Masorah we have of the Mashiach, that he's going to be born on Tisha B'Av. Was he? Wasn't he? Doesn't make a difference. He's born in 1626. It's exactly 400 years. Next year will be 400 years since he was born. Where did he get the name Shabbtai? Why that? Now, he wasn't necessarily born with the name, or did he take it on? It's not clear to me. But the word Shabbtai in Hebrew is used for the name of Saturn, the planet Saturn. And yeah, I gotta say the rings are about him. Yeah, no, it's not because of that. The concept of Shabbtai, the planet Shabbtai or Saturn, somehow is linked to the coming of Mashiach, somewhere in the Zohar or somewhere in some other kind of writings. So by having that name, that already made some kind of a connection. If you remember, we talked about last Sunday night in Tefillah, we talked about the fact that the name of, it's mentioned in Tanakh, that the name of Mashiach is Tzemach. So here he's decided to take on the name, or had the name, Shabbtai. His father, now it's interesting, when we've talked about almost every other famous person till now, oh, his father was a rabbi, and he was very Talmudic, and he gave his son a tremendous education. So who was his father? His father's name was Mordechai. He was a poultry dealer, but evidently he happened to have been very successful. He was an agent of an English trading house. He achieved some tremendous wealth in the process. So either you are a great giant Torah scholar, or you have a lot of money, and in which case one of those, or sometimes both, end up giving you some power and some influence. So he did use that influence and his power to see to it that his kid got a good Jewish education. And where he started him was two main areas, Talmud or Gemara and Halacha, Jewish law. Evidently, he didn't particularly care very much for Halacha, but he really supposedly loved learning Gemara. But at the same time, he was fascinated by something that was relatively new. And this is how, remember I told you that the Chmielnicki massacres end up leading to this idea of a false messiah, but there's one little hook I didn't put in yet. And that is, one of the things he becomes fascinated with is Kabbalah, with mysticism, which was influenced, of course, by Yitzhak Luria, right? So we already saw this idea, the birth of Jewish mysticism, and all from that he latches onto that and has a tremendous influence on him. He read the Zohar and he practiced, I think it's pronounced asceticism, of that, and all kinds of purification exercises. He was a charlatan, but in his mind, he was shooting a straight arrow. Now, there is a word in English, when I was doing some research for this, that I came across multiple times when I was reading about now and in the past about the Shabbtai Tzvi. The word in English is millenarianism or something like that. It's the belief that there's going to be a fundamental change of society that's coming, one that will bring a golden age of peace and prosperity. It's an actual word from the word mil, M-I-L-L, which is the shorish, so to speak, the word 1,000, that you're going to have 1,000 years of peace and prosperity. Look, that's not unusual. We have that idea in Jewish thought of the time of Mashiach, golden age, peace, prosperity. During the first half of the 17th century, i.e. the early 1600s, ideas about the approach of Messianic times was gaining popularity. It included redemption of the Jews and return to their ancestral land in Israel, and independent sovereignty. So if this sounds a little bit familiar to you, we haven't spoken about it yet, but if you know anything about Catholic dogma, and you something within the world of the Christianity, that part of the belief in certain segments of the Christian world is that in order for them to bring their lowercase m Messiah, that the Jews have to be on their ancestral land, in the land of Israel, that helps them. So this similar idea, again, history literally repeats itself, and ideas go from one generation to the next. So that in the early 1600s, the early 17th century, this idea of the coming of some kind of change and a Messiah of some sort, and the Jews needing to go back to their own land, to the land of Israel, independent sovereignty. This is already gaining some steam. The Christian authors had identified what they would call the apocalypse, the apocalyptic year of this to start was 1666, not connected to the 666, which you're familiar with. If you're not, that's fine. But the belief that in 1666 there would be this massive transformation, the Jews would go to Israel, that there would be some kind of Messiah, which they believe would be their Messiah, and there'll be the redemption and all that. That spread like wildfire in England in the early part of the 17th century. It was such a prevalent belief that there was a man whose name was Menashe ben Israel. I don't think I mentioned him before when we were talking about the Jews being kicked out of England, which happened, remember, not that long before the Jews were kicked out of Spain. We get kicked out of a lot of places. Menashe ben Israel, he was a Jewish scholar, he was a rabbi, he was a Kabbalist, he was a writer, he was a diplomat. He had like a great resume. He lived in Amsterdam, and in 1626 he wrote a letter. He wrote a letter to Oliver Cromwell, whose name we mentioned when we were talking about England. He appealed to reason to readmit the Jews into England. He said, you know what? We have to readmit the Jews into England. Why? I'm going to read you one sentence from his letter. The opinion of many Christians and mine do concur herein, that we both believe that the restoring time of our nation into their native country is very near at hand. So he's basically telling, and by the way, Oliver Cromwell does readmit the Jews, whether it's because of this letter or not, I couldn't tell you, that the time has come. Like you guys have been talking now for quite a while about this concept of some big change coming. Here it is. It's time for the Jews to go to their homeland, and you got to let them back first into their homeland, into England, and then he does eventually let them back in. It's not clear. When I say it is not clear, or that scholars are discussing something, doesn't mean I know this myself personally. It means because I've done my own research that scholars still try to define and understand what was the real influence of the English and Dutch Calvinist Messianism. How did that affect Shabbtai Zevi and the world that developed around him? That's open for debate. I do want to mention something that one of the reasons I love teaching is the preparation for a class. To me is fascinating because I've always come across something I didn't know before. And there is an online service called JSTOR, JSTOR, not with an E at the end, which I've come across dozens and dozens of times. They have articles where scholarly articles and books and things, and it always was until I noticed differently today that you can only really access, you can find out, you get a citation that says such and such an article, and it's on JSTOR. And you only could get it if you were kind of some scholarly endeavor. You're part of a university, you belong to a library that was connected to JSTOR. I saw an article cited, and this morning, and I said, okay, I'm going to take a look at the 2 lines I can actually see out of the whole book. And I see that you can actually sign up for 100 free articles a month. I don't need maybe 2 a month. But so I was able to read a good part of some of these things I'm telling you tonight and next week, Bezrat Hashem. In the original books that were written and, in the last many, many years, there are dozens and dozens of books written about Shabbtai Zevi, by the way. And they will talk to you. Many of them will say, we really aren't sure what was if this messianic movement or this belief in millenarianism, whatever you pronounce it, was really that significant or less significant in determining who this man Shabbtai Zevi became, and not only who he became, but how it influenced people around him. Imagine for a moment, and we hopefully don't have to imagine this much longer. Someone comes into Yerushalayim. I'm not talking somebody with a Messiah complex, going a Jerusalem syndrome, saying this Mashiach, but mamash, a guy who's somebody, and says he's the Mashiach. Now, because of the climate we're in right now, how we feel and what's going on around us, literally as we are speaking, we might be more prone to believe that Mashiach is right there at our doorstep, ready to say, "Here I am," than maybe some other time. a lot of it has to do with the client. And again, the other night we talked about what are the hallmarks of who Mashiach is, and also I'm not going to get into that tonight, but how a person is perceived is influenced by a lot of the climate. What's the history? What's the older history and the current events? Along with general messianic beliefs, there was a sentence or two in the Zohar. I've seen it referred to. I have yet to find the actual quote myself that says that somehow that the Jews will be redeemed by the Mashiach in the year of 1648. Now, why I don't necessarily accept that, and it's maybe something that Shabbtai Zevi said was in there, is that I don't believe that the Zohar would refer to a non-Jewish year. That's first of all, and unless it wasn't a Jewish year, and then it was just translated into 1648. But besides that, we have a principle in Judaism, which is ein mechashvin et haketz. We don't try to anticipate and figure out the date of when Mashiach is supposed to come. And over the centuries, there have been people who've tried, and there have been some very great rabbis that have said, okay, this is when he's going to come. And the danger with that, of course, is that when he doesn't come, imagine for a moment when Rav Moshe Feinstein Zatzal was alive, and he said the Mashiach is coming in the secular year 2025, and 2025 comes and goes, and he doesn't show up. What will we think about Rav Moshe? What will we think about the actual coming of Mashiach? And the world loved Rav Moshe. Rav Moshe was the accepted posek, the deciders of halacha around the world. So it's not a good idea. It's not a good thing. We already see this in the beginning of Parshat Vayechi when it says that Rashi says that Yaakov bikesh begalot et haketz. Yaakov Avinu wanted to reveal the day of the Mashiach is going to come, the Redeemer is going to come, and Hashem took away the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, from him, so he shouldn't be able to reveal that date. In any case, in 1648, which is that date, supposedly according to the Zohar, Shabbtai Zevi announces to his followers, he was a teacher already with some following in Smyrna, that he was the anticipated Mashiach. He's the Redeemer. Caused a lot of problems, obviously. And some of the problems that were caused by his announcing himself being his Mashiach felt to this day. And I'm going to kind of step away from him for a minute. I'm going to just give you a fast forward to the next couple of centuries, including up to today. We're talking about someone at the early stages of him declaring himself as Mashiach. There's going to be waves where he's believed, he's not believed, and of course, as I mentioned before, he's actually eventually going to die, convert to Islam and die alone. And then shortly after him is this other man we'll learn about, Yaakov Frank, who became also a false Mashiach. And then just after these two failed experiments, so to speak, is the birth of Chassidut, or Hasidism, and the Baal Shem Tov, and the beginning of the whole concept of Chassidut, which we will spend quite a bit of time on, Bezrat Hashem. And there were people, especially the Vilna Gaon, who were vehemently, publicly, staunchly opposed to this movement of Chassidut from the Baal Shem Tov. You think about it, what was he trying to do? In a sense, is infusing Judaism with joy and more devotion to Hashem and all. So what's the problem? So you had the Hasidim, and many of you know that those who were against the birth and growth of Hasidut were those who were against it were called the Mitnagdim or Misnagdim. They were the Hitnaged, meaning those who oppose. Till this very day, and why were they opposed to it? Because the people were opposed to it, like the Vilna Gaon felt we had already the false Mashiach Shabbtai Zevi. We had the false Mashiach of Yaakov Frank. This man, the Baal Shem Tov, he's just another false Mashiach. We're not going to accept it. We're not going to believe it. What he says is absolutely antithetical to Judaism. For centuries, the Mitnagdim and Hasidim were loggerheads. This one believing that they were Sabbateans, that they were also just a group of false false Mashiach leader with false Mashiach leadership and all, and those who were very much for him. The original false Mashiach, of course, was Jesus. But so the belief was that something's rotten in the state of Denmark. Shakespeare reference, of course. Today, you still have Hasidim around the world. You have hundreds of Hasidic sects. You also have people who are called misnagdim or mitnagdim, doesn't mean that they're opposed to Hasidut anymore. It just means they're not followers of Hasidut. In other words, a person who grows up in Indianapolis and has no connection to the world of Hasidut, and he goes to some city, and there's a lot of Hasidim there, he's not going, oh, they're terrible, they're going against Judaism. No, but they're mitnagdim means that they're descendants of families and people, European families, that were not in favor of Hasidut. So when you go back to this 1648, and Shabbtai Tzvi announces himself as being the Mashiach, then he is, of course, discredited. And then you have Yaakov Frank, and he's discredited. Comes along the Baal Shem Tov, and he forms what is going to be, in the eyes of some people, the same kind of problem. And you have people against him that develops two, I don't like to use the word streams, because that's not what it is, two paths in Judaism that ad hayom hazeh, till today. You can go walk around in some, a little bit in our neighborhood and some outside our neighborhood, and for sure in other parts of Ma'ale Adumim, and go into Yerushalayim, and you see Hasidim everywhere, and there's all kinds of them. And the others are mitnagdim. They have a series of their own minhagim or customs. But again, going back to that video I showed you before, and going back to this whole idea, just roll the tape backwards. Where did it start? Right here. Started here when the Shabbtai Tzvi declares himself to be Mashiach. Had there not been a false Mashiach of Shabbtai Tzvi, had there not been a Yaakov Frank, the chances are, now, as they say, hindsight is 20/20. The chances are that when the Baal Shem Tov introduces the idea of Hasidut or Hasidism into the world, the Vilna Gaon wouldn't have been opposed to it. And therefore, there would not have been a mitnagdim or misnagdim movement against it. And we wouldn't have that. Maybe everyone will be more like Hasidim. Maybe, who knows? He can't say. But that's not what happened. And we can trace it all the way back to this moment in time. So we didn't get very far in Shabbtai Tzvi's life. We're going to talk about him, Bezrat Hashem, next week more. In the meantime, just wish everyone good evening. And we should have some Besorot Tovot. And things are going very well right now. Bezrat Hashem will continue to go well for us in the skies and on the ground, and let it just continue like that.